Hi guys, thanks for tuning into this video on Obsolete Arms. I'm Mark Villarino, and today we'll be taking a look at this reproduction 16th century European matchlock musket and some of its gear that goes with it. Now, the Spaniards were the ones who have invented the musket in the 1520s during the Italian Wars. The arquebus, though, has been around since the first quarter of the 1400s. Now, it hadn't really established itself and solidified its value as a viable handheld firearm until the Battle of Cerignola in southern Italy, where the Spaniards employed the arquebus very effectively against the French in a completely decisive victory. And so now, unfortunately for the Spaniards, the arquebus maxed out at about 60 or just under 70 caliber. So it wasn't powerful enough to take out a heavily armored knight. However, something like a wall gun, which is around 100 caliber, could do that quite nicely. Unfortunately for those, for the people that wanted to try to take out those kind of knights, the knights were too smart to come up close to some sort of fortified wall to let that happen. So, to paraphrase an old saying, if you can't bring the knights to the gun, you gotta bring the gun to the knights. The Spaniards then figured, well, they're gonna need to come up with something like a really hot, heavy caliber arquebus in order to, but still have it be maneuverable, so that way they could start taking and using it to effectively do battle against heavily armored knights. And so what they did, they came up with something like an 80 caliber arquebus. Now, does this sort of bring into perspective just how much power that is? A 75 caliber musket has about as much ballistic performance as a 3-inch Magnum 12 gauge shotgun slug. Just think about this for a moment. A simple musket, seemingly simple musket, that much power, it's pretty formidable. So unfortunately, a gun that big, an 80 caliber arquebus, was just too heavy on the barrel to be easily maneuvered or managed. So what they had to do is come up with some way to support it, and that's where the fork rest comes into play. So the infantry then was issued with these heavy arquebuses with a fork rest. Now, it wasn't until the 1540s, like the Battle of Mulberg in 1547, where this sort of a setup was actually given a name, or a name was recorded. The first time that the name musket was recorded for their 80 caliber arquebus. So, now with that in mind, how about we take a closer look at the musket and some of its associated equipment. Now, this reproduction musket has a 1/3 to 2/3 octagonal to round smooth bore 75 caliber barrel with an integrated pan, a pivoting pan cover, and a flash guard, removable flash guard. And also has a cannon muzzle with a blade front sight, but no rear sight. So the way you would sight this weapon would be down the length of the barrel. This also features a rather stout buttstock made of steel, and it has what we would recognize conventional trigger with a trigger guard. This was actually rather innovative for the time, as before then the trigger mechanism, or the way you would actuate the mechanism, would be like with a lever, such as what you would see on a crossbow. That had the problem of getting caught in things like straps or belts or clothing, and so having an encased trigger with just a small little lever was absolutely a major technological advancement. Now, the mechanism here at the time was called a serpentine. It was not called a matchlock. The word lock was not applied to firearms until the invention of the wheel lock, because it required the skills sets that you would find common to locksmiths in order to make a wheel lock. And so it was after that time, which they started to be seen in the early 1500s, where the term lock was applied to this mechanism. And so, yes, it is called a matchlock, but it still retains this piece, still retains the name serpentine. Now, the mechanism is actually really simple. It has one single spring. I happen to have one here. We can take a look at the inside. This is the outside of it. This is like a spare parts one. It's missing the screw, so I'm gonna have to, kind of keep this together with just my hands. Anyway, so the entire mechanism is mounted onto a nice stout thick piece of steel. All the pieces mounted on here. And so the way this would work, if you can imagine this on here, the trigger actuates this lever. This lever pivots here, pushes up against this leaf spring, and then pivots this cam, which in turn causes the serpentine to pivot down. See if we can get you to see this. There, you can see how that works. Pivots, real simple, pretty rudimentary, almost fail-proof. Very simple, elegant. Now the jaws on the serpentine are adjusted such that your match cord can be pressed in fairly easily with just one hand, but would be tight enough so where it didn't just pull out easily during aiming, during firing, or anything like that. But you could pull it out for when you're ready to reload the gun. Now, the cord itself, back in the day, the most desirable cord would be made out of hemp and would be treated with lead acetate, which at that time they called sugar of lead. Of course, we don't use anything with lead nowadays for obvious reasons, but nevertheless, that's what they used. And the ideal match cord would burn at a steady, slow rate with a hot coal at the very end, and with minimal ash. So the ideal would be you want your cord to burn about 1 foot per hour, no faster than that. Now, of course, in the day, the infantry didn't always have access to perfect match cord, so they had to learn how to make do. And what they would usually do is they would take either linen or cotton cord and then treat that in a solution of dissolved gunpowder, because the potassium nitrate from the gunpowder then would get impregnated into the cord. You would let that dry, and then that would make a serviceable match cord. A couple of the difficulties with that, or the inadequacies with that, is it would tend to burn much faster. Both cotton and linen make more ash, and sometimes it would tend to spit sparks. Now, in an environment where you have open, loose powder, you really don't want it to have spitting sparks because, well, you got loose powder, you have a spark go where you don't want it to go, and then, or boom. In any case, that's one of the things that they could do, is make their own, and they had to know how to do that. Now, the way that the match cord was held in the hand was one end would be placed between the middle and ring finger, deep within the fingers. You would then wrap excess cord around your wrist and have enough cord to be slack for when you need to either place it in here or just hang on to it. So the other end, or the other end would go between your ring and your pinky fingers. In practice, both ends would be lit, and that's because if the end that you normally use were to go out or were to be extinguished, you would immediately have instant fire ready, or an instant hot coal ready to relight it. That's because back in the day they didn't have Bic lighters, so to get fire they would have to use flint and steel, create sparks onto some char, and then blow on it and then get fire. So it was just a lot easier to have both ends lit, and then you were ready to go. So okay, now I'm going to talk about the accessories that came with this. This is the
This is the rest. I guess you could say it's the predecessor of the monopod. The forked rest would be held onto the musket by the user's left hand. Essentially, you would be holding it like this and hold it tight because it always had to be with the musketeer. There's a strap here. This would go on to the wrist of the musketeer because at some point during the loading process, he has to drop the musket and let it drag behind him. So that was the purpose of the cord. Now the other thing that the musketeer was equipped with was a bandolier of charges. This particular reproduction bandolier has 12 charges. In practice, you would see bandoliers that would have anywhere from 8 to 14. On some rare pieces would have 16 charges. Now the number of charges was based on the size of the gun. You see, musketeers were issued 1 pound of lead that they would cast ammunition from for their musket. So if they had a 1 1/3 musket, they would be able to get 12 musket balls out of that 1 pound of lead. So they would only need 12 charges of powder. Now you may have heard this rig called the Apostles, or one of these being called an apostle. That term was something that was completely fabricated during the Victorian age by English historians who had studied extant examples of bandoliers in the Tower of London that were from the time of the English Civil War during the mid-17th century. Now, the English had standardized all of their muskets to be 1 1/3 muskets. So all of their bandoliers had 12 charges. Now, historians, being keen on romanticizing history and seeing how in history majority of wars were based or fought over religion, they rationalized that the reason there were 12 was to honor Jesus and his 12 apostles. As I've said, that's a complete fabrication. So this bandolier has 12 charges. Now the charges, the actual charges themselves, were made out of a single piece of wood. Reason for that is a two-piece design, where you would have a bottom attached to the body, was prone to failure. The bottoms would tend to fall out, and of course all the powder would just fall out as well. Now, can you imagine showing up to battle, you're on the front line, you get ready to pick up your charges, and you realize, uh-oh, I've got no powder. Imagine how a battle would turn out after that. So anyway, these particular charges have a pewter top as opposed to a wood top. They have the advantage of being impervious to environmental conditions. They will not swell, nor will they shrink due to humidity in the air or anything like that. The other thing that's kind of nice about them is since pewter is malleable, you can squeeze the sides of it in order to adjust the fit and have it be a nice snug fit. Now this particular bandolier comes with a couple of accessories that you don't normally see in a lot of bandoliers. One is an oil bottle. This particular oil bottle would be filled with either pine oil or sometimes olive oil. It would be used to lubricate the serpentine mechanism. And it also contained, or had with it, a, well, in Spanish it's called a cañutillo, which literally translates into like a canteen. This is a lit match keeper. The point or the purpose of this item would be to take a section of match cord, about as long as the keeper, and you would light one end of that and keep it within the keeper. For two reasons. One, if you're in a damp environment, having that lit match cord in here prevents it from being snuffed out due to moisture, like say, I don't know, drizzle or mist or something like that. The other reason is if the musketeer or even an arquebusier were on some sort of guard duty or night duty, having a lit match in here prevented his position from being immediately apparent, because the enemy wouldn't be able to see the glowing end of the match. Much like how in modern times in the infantry, soldiers are discouraged from smoking on the lines because that cherry at the end of a cigarette could be seen from a ways away. Another thing commonly carried on the bandolier is extra match cord. A musketeer cannot have too much match cord. So I think that pretty much covers all of the actual equipment itself. I'm going to go through on how to load and fire the musket, the steps involved. First step involves opening your pan, and then you prime the pan with priming powder. Then close the pan. You then shake off and then blow off any excess grains of powder. This is kind of a critical step, as will become apparent as I go through the process. So that's done. Then the musket is turned upside down. There we go. So it's turned upside down. You then take a charge of powder. You put that powder charge, and what's nice also about these charges is they fit perfectly inside. They're totally calibrated for the musket that you assigned to you. So put the powder down, you get a bullet out of the bullet bag, you put that down the barrel, then you grasp the ramrod with an overhand. This will become apparent in just a moment. So you draw it out, you then shorten it. You would shorten this on your stomach, but just for illustrative purposes, I'm shortening it here. Now once it's shortened to where it's manageable, then you can put it into the barrel, and now you can see why you grasp it overhand first, then it's already in your hand without having to manipulate it between your fingers, and it's ready to be rammed. You put it down the barrel, you ram the charge home. Once you're done ramming the charge home, overhand, you draw it back out of the top barrel, shorten it again, then you can easily put it where it is stored in the musket. Now you bring the musket back up. You also take up your musket rest. Now you have to set your match. Take the match cord, and then it's set into the serpentine. This is why you don't want to have any residual powder grains or anything like that on the pan, because the next step is the most dangerous of all the steps. What you do is you test the match. What this means is you manually pivot the serpentine to see that the end of the glowing cherry is going to go right into the pan. So when you do that, the only thing that's preventing this musket from discharging is this pan, and hopefully you have no residual grains, because even if there's just one grain, that could ignite and give enough spark and heat to ignite the pan under the cover, the powder under the cover inside the pan, and then cause an unintentional discharge. So now that you're fully ready, you're fully loaded, you guard your pan from the match, plus you're completely ready to fire. So once your match is all set and everything's tested and you're ready to go, the process for setting up your musket and the rest and all that is as follows. You swing out the rest, keeping it connected to your musket at all times. Shoulder the musket, open the pan, fire. You bring everything back together. You take down the match, you blow out your pan, you get it all ready for the next shot.
Now, a seasoned musketeer would be able to complete this entire loading, reloading process in about a minute. Now that sounds pretty long, which I agree, especially when compared to an archer. However, bear in mind that back in the day, warfare was a numbers game. So the more guys you can bring online in a short amount of time, the more likely you are to achieve victory. Now, it can take mere days to train a new recruit on how to use an arquebus, and maybe a couple more days to get them to learn how to use a forked rest to go with it, so for them to be a musketeer. Whereas it can take years to achieve a consistent level of performance from a archer. Now, in warfare, when different sides take casualties, if I were to bring, say, 1,000, let's say I brought on 1,000 musketeers online, and my adversary has 1,000 highly trained archers. Even after a couple of battles, if I've suffered half my, 50% casualties, within 2 weeks I can be up to 1,000 guys. Whereas my adversary, even if he only took 10% casualties, he would still have just 900 guys. Another month later, I would still have 1,000 guys because I could continue to train new guys very quickly. Whereas now my adversary has 800 guys, and so on and so on. So eventually my adversary may be down to 100 guys to my 1,000 musketeers. So the writing was on the wall. Firearms were the way to go, and with the advent of the musket being as heavy as it was and that it could take out heavily armored knights, heavy armor was also seeing its last hurrah by this point. So if you want to know more about musketry, European musketry, I very much recommend this book titled Discourse on Spanish Musketry by Andre Marc Ibirino de Broca. Yeah, don't worry about that name, it's just way too much of a mouthful. Just remember, Discourse on Spanish Musketry. It is the go-to resource. It is fully researched, it has a detailed bibliography, and it has footnotes all throughout. It even has a detailed section just on figuring out the proper powder loads for whatever sort of reproduction musket or arquebus that you are using. So this absolutely is the go-to resource. I cannot praise this book enough. So now with all of that said, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.